or from the general to the general, but it goes back and forth between the two. And writing that goes from the particular to the particular always fails. And writing that goes from the general to the general always fails if it doesn't dive down to a level of humanity. And I've always kept that in mind. So there's two things about writing that to me matter a great deal. One is construction. Don't write passively. And that was a hard lesson. That's a hard lesson for everybody. And it's a lesson, honestly, most people never learn. It's impossible to avoid in sometimes, but eventually you'll get to a point where the word "was" makes you squirm in your seat. And you know, it's just kind of, I will write something and I will go through and do a word search on my constructions of "to be," because they're just killers to narrative. So, you know, there's three parts to writing a book. One is research, and I tend to pile up all my stuff and then spread it out and try to figure it out. The other is writing, and then any other, and this is closely related to writing, is thinking, is organizing thoughts in a way that makes sense. And really, in many ways, I think most people can learn to write, but not everybody can learn to think. And it's the thinking that makes Wendell Berry, or W.E.B. Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois. The prose is beautiful, yes, but it's the thinking that makes them really exceptional. And so organizing words and organizing thoughts and constructing a narrative. And when I did Second Manassas, I mean, anyone who does a book like that, it's a huge job to organize that amount of information. One thing I do regret about Second Manassas, and I have a whole list of things I would change about it, by the way, which we'll get to, is that it's too long. I will never write a book that long again, because that itself is a barrier to many people. Reading a book like that, picking up 527 pages is, whew, that's a lot of work. I don't do it. I rarely do that. So that's kind of one lesson to me, to just to always, I try to kind of, well, my big watchword in writing was whether my mother would like it. She wasn't interested at all in history, but I knew if I could write something my mother would say, oh, that was good, or that was interesting. I figured most of the rest of the world would feel the same way, or I hoped at least they would. The rest of the world being 0.1% of the population, of course, who actually read this stuff. So Second Manassas, I started writing it in I never finished the research, but I started the process of writing in 1980, late 87, early 1988. It took me about 3 years to write. I had a child at the time, and every night, 5 nights a week, I put our girl to bed at 8:30 or so, and then I would lock myself away from 8:30 to 11 and write as best I could and as much as I could. And I was pretty diligent about that. I had the support of my family in doing that, which was obviously a big thing. And it took me, as I said, about 3 years. Now, one of the interesting things about that time is that there was a period as I was writing this book when, and I was conscious of this at the time, where I could finish a passage. I on a good night, I might write 500 words, maybe 1,000 words or so. But when I finished them at the end of the week and went back and read what I'd written, I could always tell every night where I had stopped. And the way I could tell was because my voice, the writing changed every night, which told me I didn't have a voice. I was making stuff up. And so that was something I knew that I had to fix. And at some point, and I'm not sure how it happened or exactly when it happened, I found a voice. Not the same voice that I have today, but it was a voice. And I no longer had to, I could never, after that, I could not find the breaks night to night to night or week to week in my narrative anymore. I felt that was a triumph. Today, when I write, I am totally interruptible. I'm not one of those people who needs like, 5 hours of uninterrupted darkness and, alcohol or whatever that some people use to write. You can interrupt me and I'll be able to pick it up pretty quickly. And I really am grateful for that, I have found a voice. Not everybody likes the voice, of course, which is fine. There are parts of the voice that I don't like when I read it. It's very interesting to go back and read your own book. When I went back and read, when Stackpole asked me to consider reprinting First Manassas, and I said, okay, well, give me a couple weeks to kind of clean it up and edit it up for republication. This was in 2016. I went back to read it and I was like, oh, holy cow. And I ended up rewriting 70% of the book. And in fact, there are sections of that book where the writing is considerably better than anything in Second Manassas now, I think. But you might be interested in how the book ended up getting published, because it is a kind of a lightning strike sort of story that would never, ever happen today, I don't think. I had been working on it. I hit the save button on the last chapter on August 21st. I think it was 2:21 p.m. 1991, and I got up from my desk thinking I was done, realizing I had just started. You just start a different phase. And by the way, I wrote the book backwards. I actually, because I was the most familiar with Porter's attack, I wrote that first, and then I worked backward from August 30th to August 29th, and all the way back to the beginning. Which is kind of an oddity, but it worked for some reason. So at the time I was working on the book, I had been asked by an editor at Simon & Schuster to write an essay for an anthology that they were doing. It was just a short essay. I don't even remember what it was about. It was for the Encyclopedia of the Confederacy, I think. And I was late getting that essay to this particular editor. It was the Academic Reference Division at Simon & Schuster. And so I wrote the piece, and I created the cover letter, and I said, I'm sorry I'm late with this. I've been working on another project. And then literally as I was sitting there, I said, I'll just mention it. And so I said, and if you're interested, this is what the other project is. I'd be glad to send you something, without any expectation that anything would come of it. It was purely opportunistic. I had no plans to send it to Simon & Schuster. I figured it would be probably published by the University of North Carolina Press or something of that sort. So I sent it off, didn't really think much about it. Literally 2 days later, I got a letter back saying, send the introduction and a chapter. And I did. And within less than 10 days, they had sent me a contract. And within a week after that, I had a check for $25,000 as an advance, which was astonishing to me. What had happened is that the new editor at the Academic Reference Department or Division at Simon & Schuster at the time had just moved over from the trade publishing side. And the condition of his moving to this new job was that he had to have the ability to develop his own list of trade books, history-related trade books that kind of complemented his academic reference stuff. And so he was actively looking for projects like this. And so I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. People ask me about the publishing world and all that stuff now. I never had an agent. It just happened. And I was very fortunate. And in 1993, the book came out. It has sold over time. Well, it's been published, handled by Simon & Schuster in the hardcover, 2 hardcover editions, History Book Club, 3 different paperback editions, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And over time, it has sold somewhere close to 70,000 copies, I think, which is pretty good. He told me that 80% of books sell fewer than 5,000 copies. And so that one has done extremely well. If it was published today, it would be a very different game. The market has changed radically today. One of the misfortunes of that book, from a writer's standpoint, is that it came out. There was a 5-week period in late 1992, the rush before Christmas, when Sears's Peninsula Campaign, Cousins, I think Chickamauga book, Albert Castell's Atlanta book, Shane Hess's Pea Ridge book, and my Second Manassas book came out all within a matter of weeks of each other. So that was a little bit of a logjam that didn't work to anybody's advantage at the time. And I don't think there's ever been a period of publication of campaign studies that were like that. That came out as densely as that. In fact, there's hardly been any campaign studies published at all by any major presses in recent years. So the book has never gotten a bad review, except from me, on the parts of it that I don't like. And there were one or two kind of mildly critical reviews of some of the prose and things like that. But when it's like yourself, I mean, you know what your strengths are and weaknesses are better than anybody else. And I certainly know the strengths and weaknesses, and I've learned a lot since then. I wrote this book. I started writing the book when I was 28 years old, and I was pretty stupid back then in some ways. And so I remember when you do a book like this, they always send it out for peer review. And so it went out to, I think, 3 academic reviewers for commentary, and 2 of them had nothing but good things to say about it. And the third one, who I recognized immediately, was Bud Robertson, said it was very good, except it didn't make sense to me. I didn't use enough secondary sources. That is, sources written by other people that would inform my work. And which points to kind of an interesting approach that I took, and that was that I didn't even read secondary sources. I purposely avoided them until I was done with the work at large, because I wanted to form my own opinions. I think that was a pretty immature approach to it. I think there was a lot of work done out there in the field that could have informed what I did and made it better. But when the Simon & Schuster wave came upon me, there was no revising. In fact, I will tell you that while the book went through an edit at Simon & Schuster, the version that they got was never intended by me to be the final version. That was an interim draft. And I had intended to take another couple months and work on the prose and work on the writing and get it to where I wanted it to be. But the ship sailed, and so what you have is a polished up for really kind of first draft of that book. Simon & Schuster's people did a really nice job with it. I'll tell you secrets. Their first comment was the original draft was 880 pages. And they came back and said, well, we want 750. And so this is, kind of before, digital stuff is just kind of emerging. I did write it. I think I wrote it with WordPerfect way back when. But I went from 880 pages down to about 810 simply by removing the spaces between paragraphs, by widening the margins by about 1/4 of an inch, and by removing the spaces between footnotes. So, and Simon Schuster never said a word about that. They just took it. So I ended up only having to cut about 40 or 50 pages out of the manuscript. And almost all of that, which I cut out, there were 2 sections that were cut out. I cut out a lot of detail down on the Rappahannock River in mid-August, and I cut out the entire section on the Battle of Chantilly, which literally, after bringing people through the Battle of Second Manassas and the intensity of that, there was just no way, kind of from a literary standpoint, I could bring that down and then gear people up again for another battle at Chantilly. So eventually this chapter on Chantilly was published, I forget in what magazine, many years later, as just an article. So what do I don't like about the book, or how would I criticize it? I criticize it pretty extensively in many ways. I think it's a good book, but I think it could be better and should have been better in some ways. I mentioned the secondary sources. I think one of the things that I regret tremendously is, for me, the maps of the battlefield with the house names on them were just a place setting for this event to take place. I didn't recognize, I did not deal with the fact that, you know, these battlefields were actually home places as well. I didn't even consider the stories of the people on the battlefield, the impact of these battles on them. Is it central to the narrative of the battle itself? In some ways, it absolutely is. In other ways, I mean, it's a compelling story without that. But I've always felt that I failed in at least some sort of responsibility to recognize the humanity of the landscape, quite aside from the battle itself. And so that's one thing that I would change. The biggest evidence of the sign of the times in terms of scholarship is, if I wrote that book today and it did not, if I published that book today, it would be severely criticized for a significant omission. And that is, this is a campaign that tried to kind of connect military events to kind of the larger experience of the nation at the time, the evolution of the war over time, war policies, emancipation, all that stuff. But not once in the entire thing do I discuss the impact of the Army's presence on these landscapes, on the enslaved people. I mean, the arrival of the Army of Virginia in Culpeper County functionally ended slavery in Culpeper County and in Fauquier County as well. Today, the book would rightly be criticized for omitting that. At the time, nobody gave it any kind of thought whatsoever. I will say that I've just been asked to do an essay for an anthology that Caroline Janey and Katie Meyer are doing for, I think, North Carolina Press, and I will do that chapter that I should have done all those years ago. That will be my contribution to that anthology. The biggest embarrassment, there are some embarrassments that I'll admit to in the book. There's one that rises so far above all the others, it's not even funny. And that is that there was a day in 2001, about 8 years after the book came out, that a package appeared at my door. And it was from, I think it was from the University of North Carolina Press. And I knew what it was right away because it was one of those big, heavy things. It was a manuscript someone was sending me to review. And usually those are an okay thing when they're good, but when they're bad, they can be very difficult to do because, you know, you're being asked to peer review something that sometimes isn't very good, and you're talking about someone's labors for years and years and years, and the last thing you want to do is kind of trash that. So I kind of opened it gingerly, and the title page on the book was The Memoirs of John Pope. And so I thought, well, somebody's decided to write kind of a fictional thing of John Pope and his memoirs, because there are no memoirs of John Pope, I thought. And then I looked and I looked and I looked, and I realized these were the memoirs of the John Pope of Second Manassas. And then, so I was kind of, you know, when you write something, you have this, when new information comes, you welcome it because you're supposed to, and usually you do, but there's always this little fear inside you that, is this going to say something that totally explodes everything I've ever understood about John Pope and the Second Manassas campaign? I know Virgil Carrington Jones, when he did his biography of Mosby, it was like a month after the book came out that the largest cache of Mosby papers came to light. And so that's kind of a constant fear. And then it got worse. I said, well, where are they? Where did I miss John Pope's memoirs? Well, it turns out that they were published in a newspaper called the National Tribune. Some of you probably know that. It was a GAR periodical that was published out of Washington, D.C. from 1878 to, I think, 1927. Now, what was painful about this is that I had gone through every issue of the National Tribune looking for stuff. But, you know, when you do microfilm, you get very accustomed to knowing where in the issue, like if you do newspapers, you know where the good stuff is after a while. And so then you start only going to like page 2 or page 4. And in National Tribune, the good stuff was always on page 5 or page 6. And so I went through all the issues of the National Tribune, and I never saw that on page 1 for about 18 weeks, they published the extensive memoirs of John Pope. So I was horrified by that. And then I have to say that when I read the memoirs, I was like, I said, okay, so John Pope was an excellent writer. I wish I had had his stuff. He's observant, smart observer of people, and generally very fair. But I was relieved when I found that when he got to Second Manassas, he just went to all the stuff that he'd already written long before. There was nothing new in there, but I would have been able to characterize him better. And some of the people like McDowell, characterize them a little bit better. But that is because it was just a stupid, lazy mistake on my part to miss those memoirs. That certainly rates in my mind as the biggest embarrassment. Are there any questions up here that we're getting? We are. Yeah. So why don't we break here and we'll take some questions, and then I'll get back to some other things I don't like about the book.
That'd be great. And folks, if you want to just keep adding questions, I'm going to start here with some of the ones about writing first, and then we'll get to a few about the battle itself. So the first one, how has the digital world changed your approach to research and writing about Civil War history?
So good question. Very good question. Research is much easier, of course. But I had the same question myself a few years ago. And so I didn't take the whole book, but I took 7 chapters of Return to Bull Run. And I went through all the citations, all the footnotes and all the citations for those 7 chapters to see what percentage of the stuff that I had used, the sources that I had used, were available online today. So the question is, could I have written Return to Bull Run with online resources today? And what I found, and I wrote the numbers here because I was going to talk about this if someone didn't ask. And the 7 chapters that I sampled, I think there were 25 chapters. There were 663 citations, of which 419 today could be found online, or this was a few years ago. So that's 63% of the citations online. But you have to recognize, for example, a big chunk of those are the official records. So if you pull those out, it's really down to about 50%. And of the items in my bibliography, only about 25% of the sources listed in my bibliography are today available online. So I would say about 50% of the specific citations, setting aside the ORs, are available online. But the important thing is that the sources that are not available online tend to be among the most important. For example, Fitzjohn Porter's papers, T.C.H. Smith's papers out in Ohio, John Warwick Daniels' papers down at UVA, the U.S. Army General's reports of Civil War service at the National Archives. None of those things are available online today, probably never will be, but they are critical to a study like this. So my question, the answer to your question, I think, is that you can write a good book using online sources today, unless you're writing about First Manassas, in which case you have Harry and you can write pretty much any book you want. And I mean that quite seriously. His compilation of stuff is really quite remarkable. But you can write a good book using online sources, but you can't write the book using online resources. You just can't do it. The other side of the coin, of course, is that there are many more resources available today than were then. But I will say I haven't seen anything, and I kind of keep track of stuff that comes in, both first Manassas and second Manassas. I haven't seen much in the hundreds and literally thousands of letters I've collected over the years since that changes our fundamental understanding of major events. There are some details. Scott Patchen's book is excellent on August 30th. If you haven't read it, you should read it. And he fixes some things. He elaborates some things that I fell short on. He fills in some of those missing pieces in the puzzle that I deduced or colored in. You know, it's pretty rare to see something that fundamentally alters your understanding of an event by itself. Maybe cumulatively. You know, Harry and I someday are going to do something about the chaos and the fighting on Henry Hill at First Manassas, and update something I started years and years ago. And I think I have a different understanding of that event now than I did when I wrote the First Manassas book the first time. I think I got it pretty well in the second time around. So my fear about digital stuff is that we're going to encounter a generation of historians for whom, if it's not digital, it doesn't exist. And if it's not I would even go further than that, that if it's not digital and transcribed, it doesn't exist. Because we're about to have a generation of historians entering college, some of whom very shortly will never have learned how to write cursive or read cursive. So what does that imply for scholarship, especially, you know, when you get to the handwriting of someone like Montgomery Meigs or Henry Hunt, which is almost unintelligible to someone who can read the written word. So it's going to be a very interesting time, and I'll be curious to see. I think most academics at this point still emphasize the importance of hands-on research, but I can tell you that the students that they're receiving, you know, we deal with a lot of interns, undergraduate interns, and if it's not digital and if it's not transcribed, it doesn't exist, because it's just too much work to work through some of that stuff. So that's a very good question. I hope I answered it largely well. But for me, it's a boon. I'm a little bit of a compiler. Harry and I have this partnership going on, sort of, where I send him everything I find, and even still, I'm finding First Manassas stuff all the time. Sometimes I gather stuff, like when I watch a hockey game or something, I'll go online and see what I can find. And I have a rule that I try to find a primary source about something that matters to me every day, and I do. It's not hard fishing, I must say. It's pretty easy to find some stuff. So, all right.
So in the course of your education, did you have the opportunity to take formal courses in historiography?
Yes, some, sure. But I will say that for me, the great petri dish of learning was doing the second Manassas maps. And I mean, that was probably PhD level research. And you know, who gets the opportunity to do that? Is there anybody here who's been able to go to, you know, all those places and dig for what they're looking for? And not only did I notice stuff for Manassas, but I mean, I still use those research reports that I developed for those sites, even all these years later, as reference. So I think the kind of scholarship on historiography or teaching on historiography would have helped me a great deal had it come earlier in my life, because, as I said, I thought there was virtue in ignoring secondary sources, and I firmly do not believe that anymore. I think that's just one of the dumber things I've come up with in my misspent youth. So.
John, this is one I'm going to skip around just a little bit because I'm curious about this. Which chapter of the book did you send to Simon and Schuster as the sample?
Boy, that's a good. I believe it was the Porter's Attack chapter, which I felt I had worked more on that than any other. I don't know that it's the best chapter. I don't know what I feel like is the most literarily proficient chapter of the book. But I think it was the Porter's attack thing. It was the first thing I wrote in 1981 and 82. It was the first chapter of that book that I wrote starting in 1988. And I think it was the first one I sent off to Simon & Schuster. That's a good question.
Okay. So let's do one battle question. The first one that came in to honor Darby getting here first and
Yeah.
being able to get his up.
10 minutes early because he had to get a good seat, huh?
From reading the book, is Greg's fight one of the toughest A&V actions fought in the war? And then second, how much did the Union commanders divide on abolition impact Pope's fighting of the battle?
So I think that Greg's action on August 29th, which is, you talk about landscapes of the battlefield that are kind of hard to grasp. And for me, and it might be just me, the geometry of that part of the battlefield has always been difficult for me to grasp. The angle of the unfinished railroad, the Sudley Road, there's that gas pipeline running through there. There's the gap in the unfinished railroad there. And then there's the descriptions of the rocky knoll, which is not really apparent on the ground. There isn't really a rocky knoll from that side, from the stone house side of the unfinished railroad there. The knoll is actually from the back. You have to come up from the back. So Greg's men called it a rocky knoll, but no one else really saw it as a rocky knoll. So for me, that was among the hardest areas to figure out. I would say that Greg's experience there and South Carolinians, it was a long day for them. Most of the fighting that they endured was kind of sporadic, a regiment here, a regiment there. But then, of course, they suffered Grover's attack, or at least the right wing of the brigade did, and then Kearny's attack at the end of the day. Where does it rate? I think in terms of endurance, certainly one of the longest days that any unit had in the Army of Northern Virginia, short of Spotsylvania in 1864, doesn't even begin to compare to some of those units' experience. But it was more of a grind, other than Kearny's attack, it was more of this grinding day of constant action. Very unusual for soldiers to be under fire for 6, 7, or 8 hours, as Greg's men were that day. That didn't happen very often, especially early in the war. It didn't happen very often. And the second part of the question about emancipation, it wasn't just the question is, how did Lincoln's commanders, the Union commanders, divide on the issue of emancipation? Significantly, but it wasn't just that. It was an entire philosophy of war. McClellan was the functional spokesperson in some ways, the symbol of a more conservative, more conciliatory approach toward war. And Pope was just the opposite of that. He was brought in because he was known to advocate much harsher policies. And so I would say that, generally speaking, the high command of the Union Army in Virginia in 1862 was largely conservative. Men like Reynolds and Meade, McDowell, all of these men were generally conservative Democrats, or at least conservative in their outlook on how the war ought to be waged. But there were some, including Pope, including officers in the 11th, or the Sigel's Corps, First Corps, which later became the 11th Corps. But those divisions were a significant. There's no campaign of the entire Civil War where there is a clearer nexus between politics and what happened on the battlefield. There was a direct impact of this division, this divided vision of how this war ought to be fought, which existed not only in the Army, but in the Northern populace. This whole question of emancipation, yes or no, and how should the government align itself with emancipation? Yes or no? That question hadn't been really answered yet. And in many ways, Pope's arrival in Virginia, of course, he was supposed to win a campaign, a military campaign, but it was also part of his job was to change the nature of the war. And part of that, and this is where one of the ways that I would say that I failed in the book. It is a good book. I don't mean to criticize it endlessly, but there are things that I wish I had done different. And one of the things that I did with Pope, because he's always portrayed as an obnoxious blowhard, right? Everybody thinks, and the perception is that his policies, his general orders, all of that, were the function of his obnoxious blowhard personality. And so I knew I knew he was widely considered to be an obnoxious blowhard, but I knew that his policies were not the function of his personality. The policies that he pursued in the way of a harsher war, the general orders that he issued, were authorized and in fact mirrored orders coming out of the War Department at the time that were being applied generally across the Union war effort. So I focused on Pope through the lens of policy, setting aside his personality. And I will say that when I look back on that, I think I made something of a mistake. Not that the policy didn't matter, but by setting aside his personality, I suggested it didn't matter, but in fact it did. One of the reasons he was selected, I believe, is because he was going to come in and agitate and blow up and cause a bunch of turmoil and chaos, and finally push to a decision point, this question in the Army of what kind of war was the Army going to wage. And with the federal government progressing ever steadily toward a harsher war effort, and one that included emancipation, the attitudes of its commanding officers in the Army, who were responsible largely for implementing the policy of emancipation, became more and more important as the war progressed. And it was clear to Lincoln by August of 1862 that George B. McClellan was not the man to fight the kind of war that the administration wanted. And so Pope was brought in because he believed in a harsher war. He did not believe in conciliation, but he was also brought in because he was an agitator. He was not going to back down to anybody. He was a bit of an ass. And I think that is an important part of the story that I left out of it. There's a great quote from Franz Siegel that I didn't use in the book. I purposely chose not to use in the book. He wrote of Pope, John Pope was an imbecile and a coward, affected with looseness of the brains as others are with looseness of the bowels. Now, I mean, that's almost impossible not to use that quote, but I didn't use it. But it's a pretty good representation of the degree to which he disrupted and offended. And you know what? That was part of his job. And I will say, kind of the other side of that coin with McClellan, and this might be one of the biggest things that I would change in the book, and that the biggest things I don't like about it, is that this book, my work on Manassas coincided almost exactly with all of Sears's work on McClellan, both in his papers and his biography, which is, if you've read it, you know, is not very tolerant of McClellan. And I succumbed with McClellan to a wholesale interpretation of him through the lens of his personality. Knowing better in my brain that he represented a philosophy of war that was being challenged by Pope. And I acknowledge that in the book, and I write about it in the book, but I'm careless in the use of quotes from McClellan that reflect poorly on him as a person, because I think the book leaves the impression that his attitude too, and his opposition too, was the function of an obnoxious personality. But it was in fact a reflection of a deep division in not only the Union Army, but in the federal government and in the populace at large. So I did a disservice in some ways to both of them, and especially in the McClellan one, leaving that verbiage of his on the table without kind of context and framing it more vigorously than I did. I think that's a significant shortcoming of the book.
Thanks, John. All right, so we're at 8 o'clock. Understand everyone's time, but if you've got time for one more question,
Sure.
this is a really curious one, and I'd be interested. You can keep your answer as succinct as you wish. If you could have a conversation with any Civil War general, who would you choose, and what would you ask them?
Well, in the context of Manassas, I would really want to sit down with John Pope or Irvin McDowell or both of them together. That would be fun. I'd like, I'd really like to. It's so easy to portray people as stupid in history. We do it all the time. But these were highly competent people. Even Pope, who has been painted by these, 6 or 8 weeks in Virginia that he spent as this bumbling blowhard, was really quite an intelligent man. And so I think that would clarify me. For McDowell, I would like to say, so really, what were you thinking on August 30th? What was up? Why did you make the most serious tactical error made on any Eastern battlefield of the American Civil War, as far as I'm concerned, by moving his troops off of Chin Ridge? And the question I would ask to Pope would be related to that, and say, so can you explain why exactly, when John Reynolds came to you and told you that Longstreet was out beyond your left, that you turned to John Buford, the only man that he had appointed to command in the entire army was John Buford. He turned to Buford. He didn't take Reynolds' word. He turned to Buford and said, Buford, you go out and see if the enemy is turning our left. And of course, by the time Buford got out there, it was too late. And remember, Reynolds was part of the Army of the Potomac and part of the mistrusted cabal as far as Pope goes. And that's an example of how the politics of this situation played out directly on the battlefield itself and had an impact not only on the outcome of the battle, but the fate of hundreds of lives on the battlefield itself.
Awesome. Awesome. So thank you, everyone. Really, John, thank you so much for your time.
So there's one question that I want to answer.
Oh, go for it, my friend.
So, and I'm willing to stay for as long as anybody wants. I'm not,
Same.
But Paul Severin says, do you find as you get older that your intellectual
I was going to ask that one myself.
My question to that is, do we sense that my intellectual energy is waning? Is that what that is implying? I'm very curious about that. Is Paul on anymore? Or he's not going to speak up now? Do I find that my intellectual...
Here I am.
Oh, okay, Paul. So am I losing it? Is that what you're saying?
No, not at all. I just found that, when I did my PhD at Virginia Tech, in a younger day, you talked about when you had to lock yourself away and, spend the 8:30, I think, to 11:30 and all that. And I found that I started my PhD in my 50s, and my intellectual energy just kind of drained earlier. I couldn't go for long periods of time doing research and collating research and doing what you talked about, trying to connect or correlate different references and sources. And I was just curious what your experience was, because it was a killer for me. I mean, my only success was, and I think you said this indirectly, was you had to touch your research every day, some way, in some manner. And that's the only thing that kept me alive. I had to do something on my dissertation every day. And if I didn't...
I think for me, I'm very excited about the next phase of my career when I retire from the Park Service and actually get to write again, because I really haven't. I mean, I've done little things, but nothing very big, and I've got a whole long list of things that I want to do. So I think I think there's two things that take a lot out of you, or have taken a lot out of me. One is preservation. Preservation is exhausting, and I think there is for most people who are involved in preservation, there's a shelf life that beyond which it's hard to really function. And I will say also working, I am very stimulated by the environment in which we're working now. I think it's very challenging. There's a lot of positive and negative energy surrounding the Civil War right now. I think that's very interesting. But I do find that by the end of some days, I just want to keel over because it is draining, it's exhausting. And my wife she's the director of the Fredericksburg Area Museum here. She's supposed to receive the slave auction block that was just removed from the landscape here. All the protests have left from the square behind her museum. And it has been fascinating, but it is exhausting. So so my answer is not for history, not yet. At least that I've noticed, but we're always the last ones to know that we're losing it, right? I guess, probably. So maybe I'll have that discovery.
Well,
Jeff, you
thanks.
made a reference earlier to the way Civil War history and the publishing around that has changed today. You want to share some insights on that?
Well, there was a period in the mid 90s. After Second Manassas came out, one year I kept count, and I could have done over 200 speaking engagements in a year without even really trying. The various conferences, there used to be probably 10 or 15 major conferences a year. And that's all, there are Civil War roundtables all over. That has completely changed. I mean, there's maybe 4 or 5 major conferences that survive. And in the mid 90s, it was easy to get something published. Today, it's very difficult to get anything published. I doubt that my book would get published today except by a university press, and probably whatever I write going forth, I'm not sure will be ever published by a commercial press. Maybe, we'll see. I don't even know how to get into their world now. But I think interest in the war goes up and down. We're definitely in a down phase, and I think, and I don't mean that in terms of popularity. Ken Burns' series in Gettysburg made a big bump up, and since then there's been a steady decline, but not dramatic. Our tenure, we are very much within our 10-year average in terms of visitation at our park. I think Manassas is as well, but I sense a change going on right now. I think the Civil War is going to be an unpopular period of American history for a while, partly because it's so relevant. And it used to be the kind of history was an escape to the past, to a simpler time. Well, the Civil War is not simpler, for sure, and it's not even really past, as we know. And so I think that the relevancy of it will stimulate some people. It will also deter some people, because when something's relevant, people have a hard time distinguishing between relevance and being political. They equate those two things, and they're different things. But if I do a program that is kind of relevant today, someone's going to accuse me of being political about that. So we're in a very different environment in so many different ways. I wrote something the other day for our staff. When I started in 1990, Civil War battle, we viewed a Civil War battle within the context of its impact on the campaign and maybe the war. By 2000, the kind of discipline of public history viewed Civil War battles on the arc of change of an evolving war effort, of an evolving Civil War that included emancipation and impact on civilians and all of that. So we're getting broader. Today, the question is, do we interpret a military campaign, a place like Manassas battlefield, not just in the context of a campaign, not just in the context of the changing and evolving war, but in the context of a changing and evolving society? And that's going to be the question that the Park Service faces here going forward. And it's a fundamentally different vision of war. You know, our young people, we did training with some of our young people yesterday. And you know, of course, we train them on, make sure they know all about the battles and the places and all of that stuff. And then we spent a day training talking about the impact of what's going on now on what we do and their experience. And one of them piped up and said, so we're not done with the training, so we haven't gotten this far yet. But he said, I know all this stuff about the battles, but you're telling me that the thing I really need to be worried about is understanding how these battles in this park and this story and this war fit on this arc of national change. So you need to help us with that. And 15 years ago, we would never have even considered such a thing. But now it's the first question being asked by the young people who are coming to work for us. Some of them probably a little bit nervous going out into this environment, which we start doing next week. We're going to start putting people on the landscape next week. So it's a very interesting time in public history, for sure.
Yeah, and that's a balance. Actually, the question came in while you were speaking there. Do you think we've drifted too far to the social dimensions of the war versus the more restrictive military history of the war, battles, campaigns again? It's that sort of thing. How do you find that balance?
Yeah. Well, when I wrote my book, I purposely tried to connect it to these kind of larger trends of the war and this putting this battle. And I think every park has a responsibility that every visitor has the chance to understand when they leave that park, how that event fits on this arc of changing war. And I think that's very important. And that necessarily includes some sort of conversation about civilians and slavery and policies and change and all of that stuff. Because, you know, Lincoln, you've all read his second inaugural. He talks about the causes of the war, the slavery, the importance, the difficulty of the issue. And then he says, and everything that we do depends on the progress of our arms. So he saw the connection, and it's not wrong for us to see that connection as well. I think that what we're witnessing now, and this is just my opinion, is a fundamental kind of change of the cultural DNA of the nation, where the Confederacy, which has always been kind of accorded this special place and viewed as being highly American. I mean, you know, Confederate heroes like Lee became American heroes, almost universally admired for decades and decades and decades. That's obviously changing. And the willingness of a significant portion of our population, in fact, not just Black people, not just any particular group, a lot of people, many people, to see the war through the lens, not through the lens of your ancestors' connection to it, which is how many Americans have related to the Civil War. They have a very personal connection to it. They have a family legacy to protect. And so, you know, that's changing now because many Americans, and eventually most Americans, and probably already do most Americans, don't ask what motivated your ancestor to fight, but they ask, what was your ancestor's cause? What was the nation he served fighting for? And that's a much harder question. And so when you shift from the lens of personal motivation, which has been the traditional view of the American Civil War for Americans, and you look at the war through the lens of national purpose, which is the question everybody's asking today, why did the Confederacy exist? What was the major constitutional difference between the United States of America and the Confederate States of America? There's only one fundamental difference in their constitution. That's a commitment to slavery. And that's how people are seeing the war and the Confederacy now. And that's a hard one. So do I think we're going too far? In that sense, I don't think we have any control over it. I think it is a pushback on 150 years of kind of an interpretation of the war intended to comfort rather than to challenge. And now that interpretation of the war is being challenged. And it's hard. It's hard for many people in this nation to deal with.
No,
So,
thank you. Thank you, John. Appreciate it. This has been great. Terrific. We could keep going on, but I think we need to let folks get some dinner and do some things here. John, again, thank you so much for your generosity with your time and being available and so open about things. Really, really appreciate it. Maybe we'll have to do it again sometime.
yeah, I'd be glad to. Well, hopefully, Christy will get a walk, some sort of a hike going when we can all stand somewhat close to each other again. But let me just say that the Park Service, the park needs people who care about it, and they are essential. We often, you know, when you work in a national park, you often you don't hear a voice that speaks to national significance. You often hear a voice that the voices that speak to local interest only. And sometimes that has something to do with why the park was created. A lot of times it doesn't have something to do. And Manassas has had a struggle over the years with reconciling kind of local demands on the park and its national purpose. So people who care about the park, its history, its places, its story are absolutely essential and need to be heard. And I know that most of your membership that's what they're about. So carry on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right.
And for anyone that like I said at the beginning, is not a member of the Manassas Battlefield Trust, that's how we get information out to people. Go to the website, go to our Facebook page, sign up, make sure we have your email. You'll get information from us. You'll hear about things like this, and we'd love to stay connected with all of you. And as John said, together carry on and support this important work. Thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, David.
Sure.
Thanks, Christy.
Thank you.
See you later. All right.